Everybody, Glenn McDonald, another Mainline Strength and Conditioning podcast, actually the first one of 2023. I welcome everybody back to the podcast. Looking forward to the second season, talking to all these great people that work for our government. Today we have Greg Hutson. Greg is retired from the BOP since 1996, and then he completed more work in the government, and he completely finished in full retirement as of 2006 after working several different levels of government. And today we're going to talk to Greg about his stories about the BOP and everything else he did in the military, the U.S. Marshals, everything like that. All right, Greg, take it away. Let's hear where'd you grow up? How did everything start for you?
Well, first of all, Glenn, thanks for having me. And second, following John Finello is not going to be easy.
John was he's a great guest, definitely.
Yeah, he was wonderful. I was military dependent. My dad was originally in the Army Air Corps, stayed with it after World War II, and was in the Air Force. We traveled around. I was born in Munich, Germany. Mm-hmm. We moved back to the States, Colorado Springs, March Air Force Base, Guam, Connecticut, then back to Vandenberg Air Force Base, Central Coast of California, where I spent most of my teen years, went to high school there, and enjoyed life. It was great being a military dependent. I enjoyed that, and it actually prepared me for a lot of things in life. Right. After high school, well, I graduated from Lombok High School in 1966. Mm-hmm. And after high school, I attended a community college, Hancock in Santa Maria. And I went through law enforcement classes and enjoyed those immensely. And after the first semester, I was in Mr. Mills's, I had another class, Roy Mills, retired highway patrolman. And he said, you're really into this, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I'm enjoying this. And he says, well, what do you think about going to work at the Federal Correctional Institution over there in Lompoc? It's not far from where you live. And, my head was spinning. And I'm going, well, what do I want to go to work in a prison for?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm not even 19 years old yet.
Were you more pursuing a police officer type job?
Well, that was my thought. But, I liked what the highway patrol did. Mm-hmm. Growing up and going to Lompoc, you knew all the highway patrolmen, you knew all the county sheriffs. They knew you. They'd give you rides home. So, okay.
And why was that?
It was out of the goodness of their heart. So I thought, that'd be a good way to go. I like that. I never even thought about the military. However, Vietnam was on the forefront.
Right.
It was always in the back of our minds. So like I said, I was doing good in the class, and Mr. Mills asked me if I wanted to do this. And he said the BOP, was actually the Federal Prison Service at the time, was starting up this pilot project in Lompoc. And they were looking for ways to recruit people to work in the institutions. I said, okay. And he explained it to me in some depth. And he said, if you're interested, we'll get you an interview over at the institution. I thought, okay, that sounds good. I mean, what's it going to hurt? And he told me that, and here's the hook. You're going to get paid $2.50 an hour. Oh yeah.
Big money back then.
That was huge. So I went over, I interviewed, we talked a little bit about the program, what it would entail. And it was going to be a mentoring program. And what I would do is I would shadow officers in the course of their shift. And then once a week, I would write a summary up about where I worked, what I did, and what information I gained from that week. So, I mean, that started out great. And I thought, okay, I can do this. And then I hired on in April 11th of 67. Actually, it was a federal job. I had retirement benefits. I was earning annual leave, but they made a provision for us that we only had to work half part-time. So during the course of a pay period, I just had to show up for 5 8-hour shifts.
Oh.
And in order for me to continue on to school, which was a good deal.
Yeah, definitely.
So I would usually work Tuesdays, Thursdays, and one weekend day and get my 40 hours in. And I started out, I was wearing civilian clothes, no keys, no responsibilities. And I would shadow the main corridor officer. I don't know if you've been to Lompoc or not.
Oh, yes, I have.
One of those old institutions with like a 400-foot long corridor. So I enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. But the thing about it was, I was younger than 99% of the inmates.
Right.
And did I ever get the wolf whistles? And, all of that stuff. Hey, pretty boy, blah, blah, blah. What are you doing tonight? Yada, yada, yada. And the officers just told me, said, just ignore him. Okay. So I was ignoring them. And as time went on, they would let me check out a set of keys. And the main corridor officer would go, okay, go open this door, close this door. Just real simple things. And then I would go to different housing units. And I would shadow the officers in the housing units, mostly on the evening watch, and went to the towers, worked my way around the institution. And oh my gosh, and finally I got key chits and uniforms, and they says, we need to put you in uniforms. And well, when they put me in uniform, things changed.
What was the uniform back then? Just like a gray, wasn't it? Like
it was the old worsted wool slacks with a gray shirt, the maroon tie. I think it was a 6-point cap.
Okay.
Black low quarters, and you look like pretty much like a bus driver, really. At least I thought I did, but I didn't realize the history of the BOP or the Federal Prison Service at that time. And I got to looking at some old pictures, and I mean, they were a pretty proud bunch, wore the uniforms, proudly. And it was a pretty tight outfit. So there I get my uniforms and walking down the corridor, the wolf whistles quit. All those comments were kind of gone by then. And so I felt like I was part of the crowd. And I remember coming in one evening, and one of our old salty lieutenants said, how do you feel about working the hospital? And I said, well, I've never been up there. And he says, well, we'll put you up there with the officer tonight. So I went up the second floor, and it was a ward. There were 2 wards for inpatient stuff, or people that had been down to the Lompoc Hospital that came back to recover. And said, at the most, you're going to have 6 people in here. You need to make watch calls, do the counts, watch them. He said, there's not really a lot going on. So I thought, okay, man, I'm ready for this. So let's do this. So here I am. I'm a GS3 step 1, making $2.50 an hour. And there I am in the hospital, and they got it okayed for me to do this. So I pulled off a shift, and afterwards, Lieutenant says, well, how'd it go? He said, think you'd like to do that again? I said, well, yeah, that wasn't bad at all. So they asked me, he says, well, how do you feel about working the hospital on Saturday and Sunday on the evening watch? And, okay, I can do that. And that all went towards my 40 hours for the pay period. So I did that for a little bit, and next thing you know, they're putting me in some tower jobs, and they're putting me in the honor unit, and just grew from there. And I went to work some of the, let's call them the less secure housing units, the honor and the semi-honor unit. So, I thought, okay, this isn't bad at all. And then they said, well, can you work more hours? I said, well, why not? I like the money, and plus I'm getting night differential and all those good things. So, yeah, so I would work, for $2.50 an hour, and they'd bring me in, and they wouldn't have to pay overtime to somebody.
Right.
But I was getting the experience too, and that's what I liked. And
Now back then, what was Lompoc? Was it considered what level of security was it back then?
it was an FCI.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, we were just, I guess you could say we're a medium security institution, not a lot going on there. I mean, they did have a few things happening, but most of our inmates at the time were guys that had evaded the draft or didn't go in
Oh, really?
selective service. We had a lot of inmates in there for the NMVTA, the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, which was maybe 6 years at the most. That was it. I mean, we'd get a high profile guy, maybe one bank robber, it wasn't a hostile takeover kind of thing. It was more white collar than anything else. And the other thing is we didn't have a lot of gangs, and that wasn't an issue. Well, we had a Hell's Angel or a biker Galloping Goose, some of those offshoots, but it wasn't huge. And haircuts were mandatory for the inmates. I mean, there were a lot of things going on, and it was pretty good duty. I mean, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought there'd be a riot a week. Wasn't anything close to that. We didn't have regional offices back then. I think at that time we had, it was under 30, maybe 26 institutions altogether.
Just a central office then, right?
Yeah, the central office was it, and everything pretty much came down from there. So, getting back to the assignments, I started working more responsible jobs, and by the end of my first year, I was working the high security units. I was working the main corridor. I didn't get in the control room back then. They just thought that was probably a little too much for an 18-year-old to handle. And I thought, well, that was fine with me. I like the corridor. Yeah, I love being in the corridor. That's where all the action was at. But it worked out really good. I learned a lot. We had the main core of our officers were old timers from places like Atlanta, Lewisburg, Springfield, McNeil Island, Chillicothe when it was open. We had a variety of.
Did you have staff working there from like Alcatraz when it shut down, or?
I was just going to mention that. Yes, we had a number of Alcatraz employees because just 3 years prior to that is when Alcatraz closed down, and they had to find a home for these guys. And they sent a lot of them came down to Lompoc, and that was quite an experience working with them. I really enjoyed that.
Did you like really notice like they out to like help you guys out quite a bit as far as training the newer people and
well, when the training was pretty much non-existent. It was in-house. I took the course, which was a week of learning about the Bureau of Prisons, about our institution, firearms and self-defense training. That was pretty much it. There were no training centers. A new officer would come to the institution, and that's where he'd have his, let's call it institution familiarization training at the time.
And they just read the history of the institution. That was
pretty much it.
That's about it, right?
Yeah. And then you take your test and get your uniforms. And back then, speaking of uniforms, the laundry service took care of our uniforms for us. No reason not to look good when you came to work. Yeah. And when you went to roll call, the lieutenants would check you out.
Nice.
I mean, it was an old time roll call.
Oh yeah.
You were expected to be there, and there wasn't any of the portal issues. Staff were just the kind of people that were concerned about their jobs. They would show up early. Now, not to say there weren't a few Minutemen along the way, but I learned from the old timers about coming in early, and that was a good lesson learned.
Oh yeah, definitely. So
and then things changed quite a bit. We'd have roll call for evening watch. We'd have roll call for day watch, and some lieutenants had it for the morning watch to pass on information, or either just check in and go to your job.
Right. Yeah, when I first started, we still had roll call for a while, and I always thought it was a good thing. People got together and got to know each other a little bit more, and the information passed on was always key too. So
that's a good point, and I think that the lesson learned from having the roll calls was the information that the lieutenants were able to pass down.
Right.
For example, if you're going to L units, there's we've got some issues with some of the inmates down there, and you need to pay attention. That helped out. There was a good line of communication back then.
Mhm.
You have to remember that back then, some of the officers were spending 20, 25 years and never got higher than a GS7.
Mhm. Right.
And it's not that they weren't good at their job, there just weren't that many positions. And only after I started did they have the GS8 program. So they started having GS8s, and the lieutenants were 9s, 10s, and 11s. And if you're an 11 lieutenant, you walked on water.
Oh yeah, you're
And
God back. Oh, I'm sure you were.
oh, you
Yeah.
were huge. And
Yep.
an 11 lieutenant spoke, you listened. And 11 lieutenants back then pretty much ran the institution. You didn't see the wardens very much.
Right.
You would see associate wardens on occasion, but they pretty much would hang out at the front lobby. We did have, my first warden was Warden Joe Bogan, and his son became a warden later on, in fact, retired from the Bureau. But anyway, Joe Bogan was one of the first people I talked to, and he would show up at the control room every so often during shift change on the day watch, from morning to day watch, just to check things out. And so back then, he was considered a hands-on warden. He was a good guy. I sincerely believe that Warden Bogan had the staff's best interest at heart, and it showed when we had some disturbances.
Mhm. What kind of disturbances did you guys have there? I mean,
it was usually ethnic. It was along the lines of like Mexicans and black, or the white and the blacks, that kind of thing. And it was all before the gang issues. So, but they weren't huge, but they were just enough where it created problems, and we'd have to have a lockdown. And then we go in and do the searches, and they'd back up the dump truck, and they'd load up all of the excess stuff that the guys had. And back then, the incident reports they weren't the kind of format that we had now. It was just 2 pieces of paper with a piece of carbon paper stapled in between. You didn't have a number for an offense. You just, whatever it was, if somebody flipped you off,
just wrote a story. Right.
So yeah, you would write down whatever you thought, disobeying an officer, cursing out an officer. It was interesting times back then. And then they had in lower I unit, the segregation unit, there was a trap between the corridor and the cell block, and that's where they would hold adjustment committee, and that's what it was called back then. And I wanted to go in there one time to see how it worked, and they said, "No, son, you don't need to go in there right now." So okay, fine. So usually when somebody went to the adjustment committee, if they didn't go spend time in seg and they came out, they had a sincere attitude change.
I bet. So how did working on the job and going to school, did that really affect you as far as helping you with your schoolwork?
Just the opposite.
Oh, really?
I liked the money, Glenn. It was adding up, and I was actually paying more attention to that job than I was going to school. And my grades suffered a little bit. That was my fault. I knew I could correct it. All I had to do was say something to them, but I didn't. And I started working more. And then next thing you know, I'm on the roster. Because I was a GS3, and then after the first year, I was promoted to GS4, they couldn't give me an assignment. Mm-hmm. All they could do was put me on second-annular activities. So I would work 2 weeks in a tower, 2 weeks in one of the units, 2 weeks in the hospital. I even got the quarter number 2 assignment for a couple of weeks, and I thought, you know what, this is good. I'm moving on up. I'm doing some things.
How many others were in that program? Was there more people than just you?
Yes, there was. When it first started out, had a gentleman, another gentleman with me, Ron Klein. And surprisingly enough, Ron's father was the last, the military, commandant of the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Lompoc.
Wow.
Uh-oh, I lost you.
You're still there. I got you.
Okay, well, I don't see you. I wonder if I can do anything let me log back on here real quick, see if it'll,
Did your screen turn off?
yeah, the screen it
Yeah.
died on. Well, Oh, there you are. Okay, I got you back. Yeah, Ron Klein's father was the last commandant, and what I didn't mention was that Lompoc became a functioning Bureau of Prisons institution in 1959. And the institution was built, I want to say, in the 40s. And it was the West Coast Disciplinary Barracks. It helped alleviate population at Leavenworth. But anyway, Ron's dad was last commandant, and he joined the program, and he did a lot better than I did. He went on to graduate from college, and he went into industries and worked his way up in industries. I'll just pretty much let it go at that. He didn't have a good ending. He took advantage of a situation, and eventually he was fired and let go. Had to do with theft issues, sending government property to his house, and he was in a position where he could do that. So, but anyway, but it was successful for him. And then they hired a couple of fellows that from Hancock that were from Samoa, and great guys. Cheng and Makua, and they were funny, but after about 3 or 4 weeks, they realized this wasn't for them, and they left. And then 2 others were brought on, and then that was the end of the program.
I mean, it got some bodies in there to help out.
Yeah, it got me, and I don't know if that was a blessing for the prison service or not, but I mean, I liked it, and I thought, okay, this wouldn't be bad. And then I was almost done finishing my 2nd year, and Uncle Sam decided he wanted a piece of me, and
Right.
And then draft notice came in, and I let my deferment expire. I didn't have any reason not to go in at that time.
I was when we talked earlier about that, I was interested in that because I figured, because you were already in like a federal system, working for the federal government, and you still got drafted, huh?
Yes, I did. And
Oh,
I checked into that just briefly, and
Yeah.
selective service, that government job or not, I wasn't a doctor or some kind of professional.
Right.
And so they says, no, you're good to go. And, I had a heartbeat, and, I could put one foot in front of the other, and I make light of it, but no, it was a little more serious than that. And went in April of 1969. It was right when Eisenhower passed away. And I remember that because we had 2 days that they didn't mess with us. It was, it was pretty calm around Fort Ord at the time. And then I remember going into a meeting with a specialist they called him a counselor, and they wanted to find out what we had done in life. Were we outdoorsmen? Were we big game hunters? And where that's going, or were you a librarian or whatever? And I said, well, I worked in the Federal Prison Service for 2 years. And the guy says, well, what about the MPs? How does that sound to you? And I says, well, what do you have in mind? And he says, well, disciplinary barracks or something in the line of corrections. They can always use those people. And I said, well, okay, go ahead, submit my name if you want. And there's a friend of mine from Lompoc who was drafted at the same time, Bill Simpson, and he interviewed right after me. Bill had never done anything in his life other than bag groceries and wash cars. Good guy, don't get me wrong. He wasn't really motivated, and he was a party kind of guy. Well, anyway, we're going through basic, and we're doing all of these different evaluations and testing, and I seemed like I was always going on to the next battery, and I finally figured out what was going on, and they were eliminating some guys along the way. Well, Bill got eliminated, and I think there were about 4 of us that made it to the final final battery of the evaluations. And about that time, we graduated from basic training, and our orders came down, and they go, Hutson, Gregory, it's infantry. I go, what? I'm looking, what infantry? I thought I was going to go MPs. And Bill got the MPs. So I think,
really?
yeah, Bill gets MPs. He didn't have a clue. And I think what happened was the guy, two Lompoc people right after each other, and probably forgot who he talked to and said, oh, this guy must be it. So,
Oh, wow.
so anyway, that was fine. It was what it was, but I did good in the testing, and I had qualified for the Drill Sergeant Academy, which would mean I would have got temporary promotion D5. If I completed the program, I would have got a promotion D5, and I would have been a drill sergeant at Fort Ord. I would have stayed there my entire time. Just so happens that my drill sergeant in basic training had gone through the same program. And he says, it's not a bad deal. He says, look at me. He says, I'm doing my 2 years and I'm going back to Pennsylvania. And I said, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. But I also found out that I qualified for a job as an airborne sensor specialist in an OV-1 Mohawk. And what I would have done is sat in the right seat, and I would have looked at this monitor and, oh, they're the bad guys. And it was kind of infrared or whatever it was. And I never did get into that program. But that was another opportunity. So there you go, Army Aviation. I'm thinking, okay, that's a good step in the right direction. And Lieutenant Albers, who was our company commander, said, not only did you qualify for that, he said, you qualified for OCS. Oh, okay. And he said, you qualified for Warrant Officer Flight School. Oh, okay. And he says, then you qualified for West Point Prep School. He said, if you want to go to, I think it was Fort Eustis. I may be wrong. But anyway, if I would go there for a year and then complete the program and then enter West Point as a cadet freshman. So I gave it some thought, talked to Lieutenant Albers, and I talked to some friends of mine who had gone through these programs, guys that I knew. I didn't have to give them an answer that day, but I didn't have a lot of time. So I called up a friend of mine who had just gotten back from Vietnam. He got drafted and went to OCS, went to flight school. His name was Bruce, and Bruce and I grew up together in Vandenberg. And he says, yeah, he says, I'll tell you what, he says, you go to flight school, you don't have go through the hard knocks that the warrant officer candidates have to. He says, you get that out of the way in OCS. And he said, plus you earn a lot more money than they do. As a commissioned officer going through flight school, you get your pay, you get flight pay. You don't have to just make formation in the morning and before your class or before you go to the flight line. And he says, there you go. So I talked to Lieutenant Albers and I said, yeah, I'd like to go to OCS. And boom. No sooner got into infantry AIT at Fort Ord, and then the interviews started coming. So I interviewed for OCS, and I did good on the interviews, and I was recommended for OCS. I guess I said something they liked, but they gave me orders. Well, no, they said I was going to be going. I qualified. They will get a class set for me. And then after AIT, I was at Fort Ord as a holdover, and they assigned me to the company that I went through AIT at. So I was the company driver for a little while. And then the orders came down for OCS. And that was in right about the time of the World Series, because the Mets were playing the Orioles. And that's when the amazing Mets won the whole thing. So get to Fort Benning, Georgia. After driving across the states, I brought my car with me. And at Fort Benning, I spent about 3 days just getting the lay of the land. I wanted to prepare myself a little bit. So I walked around some of the company areas, and I was talking to some of the candidates. The senior candidates were those guys that had 18 weeks in and were getting ready to graduate. So I talked to a few of them and said, I'm going to be starting. They were more than helpful, gave me some tips, some ideas, what to do, and just pay attention. And boy, next thing you know, here we are. We're at I'm at the 54th Officer Candidate Company in Fort Benning. We're right across from the famed jump towers, and also in view of Infantry Hall. And I was thought, oh, wow, this is it. This is the big leagues. And for the first, I don't know, first 10 days, it was just pure harassment. And they were just trying to weed people out. And I understood that. And so I just kept my nose to the grindstone.
Yeah, but if you got weeded out, you probably went right to the infantry, right?
Well, either that or you're going to go as a dog handler, one of the two. So, take your choice. But a lot of the guys, yeah, well, we started out with 240. And I think we lost by that time, we had lost one of the 60-man platoons. That's, through all the different platoons, we probably lost, 10 in each platoon. Oh gosh, where was I? Oh, I remember I just was upstairs one time and, after they threw all of our stuff out on the floors, here where we're refolding it. And one of the runners comes up and he says, Lieutenant Bailey, who was my platoon leader, wants to see you down in his office ASAP. So that didn't mean, it meant going down the stairs. We were on the top floor and I thought, well, maybe I should jump, I should go from the top floor, but now I'll walk down. So anyway, I got out there and I knocked on the door and he said, enter. And he says, Lieutenant Bailey said, this is Candidate Hutson reporting. He says, shut the door. And he says, sit down, relax. And I said, I'm not falling for that.
Yeah, exactly.
I stayed braced and I looked straight ahead and I says, all due respect, sir. And he came over and got in my face. He said, Candidate Hutson, he said, that's not a request, that's an order. Sit down and relax. Okay. And he said, you went to Lompoc High School? I said, yes. He said, do you remember a football game with Arroyo Grande? And I said, oh yeah. I said, our senior year. I said, Arroyo Grande came there. I said, do you remember one of the football players that had a cast on his arm? I said, I remember that very well. I said, what's that idiot doing out there? And he said, well, I was that idiot. So anyway, we had, I don't know, maybe a half hour or so conversation and we talked about, the high school days and what happened. And we actually knew some of the same people. So when it was over with, he says, well, hey, it was nice talking to you. And he says, when you leave that door, it's back to normal. He said, you don't know me? And I said, okay, yes, sir. So anyway, that was it. That was the only casual conversation I had with Mark until then. And then he ended up leaving us before the cycle was over. But I understand he went to Vietnam as an infantry platoon leader and was successful and came back. Good guy though. Oh my God, he was focused. So
did you see the training and your experience in the Bureau? Did it help you get through OCS? Because
I think it had a lot to do with it. It was very paramilitary, plus my experience being a dependent.
Oh yeah, yep.
My dad's brothers were all in the military. One of my uncles was a retired colonel. He was an infantry officer over in the Pacific. 2 Purple Hearts with 2 bayonet wounds. I guess that didn't get any more personal than that. But I learned. I had another uncle who was a corpsman. He was in the Navy and went with a Marine unit, and he was on a number of islands in the Pacific. So, I had some role models to look up to, and I always kept that in the back of my mind. And I always wanted to make my dad proud too. I did not want to fail OCS.
Right.
That was not in the cards. However, sometimes you didn't have any choice. But what I did was I started hanging out with some of the prior service guys. One of them was a Ranger, one was Special Forces, and the other was just an airborne infantry guy, and they were all Vietnam veterans. And I told them, I said, fellas, I said, I'm here to learn, but I'm here to learn from you guys too. And they liked that. So they took me under their wing, and they weren't in my platoon. However, I did do a lot of stuff, and every once in a while they'd say, here's what we're going to be doing. You need to pay attention to this. Or they said, if you have any problems with scholastic side of things, come down, see us. And I would go visit them. And, there were a few things as far as doing squad, platoon and company operations that we would be tested on that were kind of confusing to me, but they pointed it out and in ways that I easily understood. Well, then that was fine. I, went on and I was thankful for Clarence Dodd, Jim Allen, and gosh, I can't remember can't remember the other fellow's name, but all three of them had been drill sergeants as well.
Oh, wow. A lot of
So
experience.
I think I was very fortunate in seeking them out, and, they helped me with a lot of things. And so we were pretty much into the program. I think we were about halfway through or getting close to being halfway through, and our commanding officer came out one day. He says, "How many of you guys want to be aviators?" And boy, my hand went up. I was the first one up, and people were looking at me like, "What are you, nuts?" I go, "What do you mean? I'm going to get to fly for free, if this works out." So, so he met with about half a dozen of us, and interesting enough, all six of us went on to flight school.
Mhm.
And he talked to us and he said, "Here's what I did. I was in your position a few years back. I went to flight school." He said, "I enjoyed it. I flew a Huey. I became an aircraft commander." And, he really built it up, which and well deserved. And so we all took him up on it, and we took the test that you needed, the physical, and all the other tests that we needed to take. And, we could look at a picture and tell if an airplane was turning left or right, climbing, descending, those kinds of things. And it worked out good. And I was selected for flight school. And they said, upon successful completion of OCS, we will, you'll be put in on a list. And I thought, okay, that's pretty neat. I said, well, that's probably a year down the road. So it was OCS workout. I graduated. They sent me back to Fort Ord, where I had come from. And I remember when I got back to Fort Ord, I wanted to see one of my platoon sergeants, Sergeant Jackson. He was infantry guy himself, Vietnam vet, but one of the most encouraging people I'd ever met in my life. He'd not known us, and he was Air Force. He's here to help us. You have any problems, come see me, whatever. And I remembered that. I remember that about him. So I get back to Fort Ord, and I have on my uniform. I've got my brand new highly polished second lieutenant bars. And I go back to my company area, and the company commander was our executive officer at the time. And he had been promoted to captain since, and he remembered me. And he says, "Well, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I would like to, with your permission, to go see Sergeant Jackson at some point in time." He said, "Well, he happens to be upstairs. You remember where the old second platoon was?" I said, "I do, Captain." And he says, "Well, go on up and see him." So I go up and I walk through the door, and he didn't see who it was, but when an officer walks into a room, they call the room to attention. Glenn, I was not long ago, I was the one calling attention. So Sergeant Jackson comes over, he's talking to the platoon, and he looks at me, and his eyes got this big, and he had this smile on his face, and he gave me a salute, and I saluted him back, and I gave him a big hug, and he gave me a big hug, which now that was very unusual
Right.
at the time. But what he did for us, that meant a lot to me.
That's great.
So he even had a tear in his eye, and he says, "Thanks for coming back." He says, "You're the first that's ever come back to see me that went through OCS." And I said, "Well, you made an impression." So he said, "Do you mind if talk to the guys?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, and he introduced me, and he said, "This time last year, he was right where you were at." Yeah. And he won. And he said, "This is what can happen if you pay attention." And, I don't know, it was kind of an ego thing for me. I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. So anyway, I talked to him, and I'm onto my own unit, and I get to my unit, and I report to Captain Phelan. Captain Phelan had already spent 2 tours in Vietnam as an infantryman, special forces. This guy loved it. He loved that action. He loved being a special forces guy. And now I know why he was divorced. So anyway, we got talking. The first thing he did is, "Let me show you these pictures." And, they're all headshots and stuff, and all in black and white pictures in Vietnam, and all the VC and NVA guys. And he says, "Yeah," he said, "I'm going back to this." And, oh, okay. So anyway, we got talking. I said, "Well, when's the new company commander coming in?" He says, "Well, he's not." He said, "You're it." I go, "What?" This time last year, I'm a trainee, and now I'm going to be XO company commander. And he says, "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to introduce you to the first sergeant. He says, Top's a good guy. He'll take care of you. I said, okay. So Phelan says, just to let you know, he says, this time next week, I'm leaving.
Mhm.
He said, I'll be in and out, but it'll pretty much be here. So he goes to introduce me to the first sergeant, and we're talking a little bit, and Captain Phelan says, well, I'm gonna let you two get acquainted. He says, I'm gonna leave. Okay, that's fine. So as soon as he left, I went up to the front of the first sergeant's desk, and I saluted him. I said, First Sergeant, I said, Lieutenant Hutson reports. And he looked at me and he says, son, don't you have that backwards? And I said, no, First Sergeant, I don't. I said, my dad retired as an E9, and the one piece of advice he gave me was, no matter wherever I go, he said, report to the First Sergeant. So here I am.
You go.
I said, like you, he's a World War II veteran. And he said, son, have a seat. And he said to me, he says, we're going to get along just fine. And he said, with that kind of attitude, I wasn't there to win over anybody. I was there I wanted to learn.
Yeah.
So, here are the rules of the road. He told me things. He says, you're going to be a busy guy. You're going to be all by yourself. He says, I will be putting paperwork in front of you from time to time. He said, just go ahead, sign it. And he says, I'm not going to ask you to sign. Oh, there we go again. Bear with me.
Yeah, it just timed out. That's no big deal.
He said, I'm not going to ask you to sign anything that I wouldn't sign myself. So, okay. So that worked out pretty good. And he got all of the drill sergeants together. And he said, he talked to him and he said, this young man here, he says, I know is not going to want to make life tough on anybody. He said, he's here to learn. He's going to rely on you. He said, you know what, he's by himself. Captain Phelan's gone. We need to give him a break. This time last year, he was a trainee. So after that must
have been something else. Go from E1 to O1 within
yes,
going back to basically the same area, and just it's
the exact same area.
That's something.
It was, and after First Sergeant gave the pep talk, it worked out quite well. I didn't bother the drill sergeants. I didn't try to tell them what to do, and they would always give me advice about when we get to this training area, the battalion commander is going to be there. Once you wait right here, we'll take the guys on down to the training area, and when you're done with the battalion commander, he said, then you can come down and join us. But they gave me the straight scoop. They didn't try to get over on me. It was all good advice, because I was in pretty good shape then, because I was running with the troops as well. And finally the drill sergeant says, you know what? He says, we'll get the troops out there. He says, we'll get you a Jeep and get you there. He says, you're worn out. He says, you have to be with us, from the very first thing in the morning till the very last thing in the evening. He says, where we have different shifts with the drill sergeants. We got the early and then the late guys. So, I mean, it didn't take long, and they took good care of me. And I was really, I'll say blessed. I was a lucky guy. I had some good mentors. And not long after that, my orders for flight school came along, and that was quick. I wasn't expecting that. So I was back in May and June. And July, I'm going to start flight school first week in July. So I needed to get a lot done. And the first sergeant said, you know what, we got this covered. We'll take care of you. Says, do what you got to do, get ready for flight school, and just check in with me, morning, noon, and night. And said that should be fine. We should be okay. And the battalion commander pretty much knew that they were, running thin as far as officers went. And he was good to me as well, and let me get ready for flight school. So there it was. I've Fort Ord. Now I'm going back across the country and
going to Fort Rucker.
Well, I went to Fort Walters first. At that time, flight school primary flight training was in Mineral Wells, Texas. And we jokingly called it Miserable Wells. And if you've ever been there, I mean, you'll know why.
Yep.
Wasn't nothing there really, except rattlesnakes and occasional, ground squirrels or whatever. I had gotten married in the meantime, and I took my new bride back there, and she was used to, let's put it this way, she had a comfortable life. Family she came from, her father was a builder, and they had a lot of things. Well, now I'm taking her from that to a 8-foot wide, 40-foot long trailer in the middle of summer in Texas, and it had a window air conditioner,
Oh, geez.
and that didn't go over too well.
Oh, I bet. I bet.
Plus, I was going to be, if we were flying in the week in the morning, we would be leaving the house at 6, and if we had classes, we had ground school that week, then we didn't have to leave till 7. And sometimes we didn't get home till late because of the weather. We'd have to fly later. A lot of our time was occupied going to the student center on weekends. So I didn't have much of a social life and much of a honeymoon, so to speak. So we got through that, and that was in November of 1970. Moved on to Fort Rucker, where it was going to be instrument training and getting into the Huey. And that was, the Huey, that was the ultimate. I said, oh my God, we're going to fly Hueys. And somebody said to us one time, says, there are things bigger than a Huey, like a B-52. And I go, oh, okay. So, but to us, the Huey was it. That was the holy grail, so to speak. So we got through instrument training and weeded out a number of the students couldn't grasp the instrument part of it. At first I had a difficult time, and then one of the instructors helped me out and mentored me for a little bit. And then I finally figured out these approach plates. It was if you didn't understand the approach plate, it was gibberish. And that's what it was to me. I didn't get it, but then he explained it. Okay, good, I'm good to go. And now my first flight in a Huey in the pilot seat. And I didn't wet my pants, but I came awfully close. And a lot of us were the same way. We were just, jaws were dropped. We're looking at this thing. We're doing a pre-flight inspection on it. We're going around looking. They said, okay, you're going on your first orientation flight with Captain Cole. And boy, we started it up, and, he showed me things we were doing. I didn't touch anything, but I was, there to observe. And he says, this is it. And then blah, blah, blah. And he cranked it up, and, here we go. And we're hovering in this thing, and I'd flown the TH-55 and I'd already soloed. So that was, I had been through that part, but to be in a Huey, it was like going from an MG to a Corvette.
Oh, wow.
And, not exactly that fast, but the idea being, you moved up. And man, I paid attention from then on, and we did auto rotations, simulated engine failures. We probably did more of those than anything else, and we would take off. They'd cut the throttle on you, find a place to land, and they'd do a power recovery, but then we'd go back to the airfield and we'd do 100, 180, 360s. Rotations and straight in auto rotations, low level auto rotations. Fortunately, I never had to use that. The Huey was a great aircraft made by Bell, Lycoming Motors. They had a good history, and it was just a thrill to be there. And then towards the end of flying the Hueys, they had asked, anybody want to volunteer for gunship training? And I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, you get to wear a black hat. And I said, sign me up, because gunship pilots wore black hats traditionally. So I signed up for the gunship training, and I'm glad I did. I got to fly a B model. I don't know if you can see that picture on the back wall. That's a C model gunship, and that's what I flew in flight school. So that's where I got my armament qualification. And
But they had the miniguns and the rocket pods on.
It had the miniguns and rocket pods, and the ones we flew in flight school also had the M79 grenade launcher in front, the chunker.
Okay.
So there were 3 different things that you could shoot, and the pilot of the gunship would sit in the right seat, and he would fire the rockets. He's the one that just took the aircraft wherever it went. And then there was a drop down unit, and that was for the guns, the miniguns on port and starboard side, and you could traverse those up and down. And then the guy on the left seat would also fire the M79. So got pretty proficient with the minigun. The minigun it was awesome. What a weapon. And then the M79 was a lot of fun. It was kind of like, oh gosh, it was a precursor to all of these games that you see, where you had to lead. And so you kind of figured that out a little bit. And then I got to sit in the right seat and fire the rockets. And they said about firing the rockets, make sure you keep the aircraft in trim, because the fins on the rocket are going to seek the prevailing wind. And if you're not in trim, you shoot them out of trim, and then they'll find the wind and they'll go wherever they want to go. Okay, fine, we got this. I'm all set. I'm ready to go. Well, my first pair of rockets were going downrange. We're hot. We're coming in. I have a warrant officer sitting next to me, and I'm not paying attention to the trim. I've just got this thing. I should have been crabbing it, but I wasn't. I was going straight in, fired off my first pair of rockets. And I have to believe to this date, they're still somewhere over Alaska. Those things took off and didn't even come close to the target. And I remember the chief took control. He says, okay, he says, I have the aircraft. He says, think about it. What did you do wrong? What did you do that everybody else does? I go, oh, trim? He's a smart boy here. So anyway, he says, okay. He says, now remember, we're going to go in here. We're going to crab. And next pair of rockets were fairly close. I kept them on the range anyway. And then after, I don't know, we fired about dozen pairs of rockets, and learned how to do it. And so I'm gunship qualified out of flight school, and you graduate, get your wings, and think, oh man, this is it. I mean, this is, I've graduated from OCS and now I have my wings. And I said, I'm not the only guy in the world that's done this, but the effect it had on me, now I'm an Army aviator now. There's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. And, pretty soon the smile went off my face, after graduation. I thought, this is cool. I'm going to, go home and get to show mom and dad. And in fact, my dad even called the base commander who he had worked with when he was on active duty. And he said, my son just graduated. He says, you think you can get him a ride on the Huey out at the base? And I've got to fly a Huey out of Vandenberg, an Air Force Huey. And I thought that is the coolest thing. So I got to fly around the town of Lompoc, up the coast, up to Pismo Beach and down towards Santa Barbara. And, it was basically 2 hours of boring holes in the sky. But I'll tell you what, it was a trip. So I ended up going to Fort Lewis afterwards, and I'm assigned to an air cavalry unit, the 3rd Cav. There's a lot of history with the 3rd Cav. George Patton was with assigned to the 3rd Cav at one time. But anyway, we were the Yellow Scarfs, and we got to fly. And I flew mostly, I think Craig Smith and I were the only two that were not Vietnam veterans. So here I am amongst, I'll call it this royalty, all of these guys that had this experience. And I mean, I honored those guys for what they did and what they'd been through. And some of the guys had never completed a tour. They came back wounded, and a lot of them made it back unscathed, and they were instructor pilots, instrument pilots. And I talked to my platoon leader, John Stoddard, who hadn't been back that long. And he says, well, you're with us in the gun platoon. He says, the only thing is we don't have any gunships. I said, okay. And he says, yeah, we'll be flying the B model in our platoon. He said, if every once in a while, he said, if you want to go over and fly an H or a D model, you can do that. And I said, okay. He says, all you got to do is ask. And I said, well, while we're at it, I said, I would like to volunteer for any and every flight that comes up. And I was living on post and not far from the flight line. And he says, well, I'll remember that. And he says, you might want to go let the slick platoon leaders know that too. So I went over and I talked to the 2 captains there, and I said, if you got anything, guys don't want to fly on weekend, or if you got a late night mission or something, I said, you're looking for a pilot, put me on it. And at first, not much happened. And then, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks later, I was flying every day. I was flying on weekends. I was flying for the MAST program. MAST was, at that time, it was the medical evacuation program that the military offered the local community. They didn't have civilian helicopter entities at that time to pick up people. And along Mast, we'd go out to the highway if there was a crash. We picked somebody up. We flew over to the coast, picked up pregnant women that were having problems delivering children. And boy, I got to do a lot of flying, spent some time with some awesome pilots and learned a lot.
A lot of experience doing all that. Yeah. Which
Oh,
helped
that
you.
was, Glenn, that was one of the best. I would seek out one of the IPs, Mel Latham, and I'd say, Mel, I said, I've flown with you before. What do you got? What can you tell me? And he says, well, let's go out and do some auto rotations. And I said, okay. So we'd go out, and Mel would put me through the auto rotation program again. And it's not that I wasn't tired of it. To me, it was essential. It could be a life-saving maneuver at some point in time. So we did every kind of auto rotation you could think of. We were on the ground. He would cut the throttle and he would bring that thing up. The inertia in the blades would just, it was tremendous. And he'd bring it up to a hover, do a 360 and land it. And he said, okay, you do that. So we'd bring it up to speed, boom. Pretty soon I got the point to where I could do it. And Mel says, you know what? He said, you need to transition into another aircraft now. And he said, you also need to pursue your instrument training. I said, perfect. So next thing we did got me into doing instruments. I go with Captain Larner. Boy, I went in that link trainer and I studied as hard as I could, because back then the instrument training they gave us when you got out of flight school, they called it a tactical ticket. And all that meant was that hopefully when you got into the clouds, you could stay straight and level and not fall out of the sky. So now I'm going for the big boy ticket. And I spent time with Jay Larner. He spent a lot of time with me. I've got my instrument rating, and then I've got an OH-58 Kiowa transition. So I was flying just about every waking moment I was flying. And I've amassed quite a few hours at Fort Lewis with a variety of different pilots. And they all taught me something different, all taught me something good. And I left, oh my gosh, I guess it's about 10 months later, I'm going to Vietnam. And just before that, the troop commander, the aircraft troop commander, didn't like me because I was not a Vietnam veteran. Here I am, I'm a first lieutenant new guy, but I'm doing most of the flying for the troop.
Like that.
So just before I go over, here we are in the winter in Washington, he sends me to cold weather survival school. Nice. And I've got orders for Vietnam. And right. I go, cold weather survival school. And I thought, oh my gosh, can you bear with me for a second?
Of course.
Puppy, I have to put puppy dog out. Come on. Only be a second. But yeah, then I when I went over to Vietnam, I got to my unit and they were looking at my qualifications. And they said, oh, you've gunship qualified. And I said, yes, I am. But it was in B models. And by the time I got over to Vietnam, the B models were gone and all they had were Cobras. Excuse me, let me get her back in. So I said, well, you've got Cobras. I'm not Cobra qualified. And they said, well, you're familiar with the XM system, correct? And I go, yes. He says, good, we need front seaters. Well, okay. So, it's the best ticket in town. I mean, you've got the best view of any helicopter ride ever in the front seat of a G model Cobra. So they put me with a couple of the pilots and they took me on an orientation ride, and I got to go out to the big rice paddy and we fired off the miniguns and M79 grenade launcher. So what I was doing was firing the armament that was under the nose, the turret, and the rockets.
Whereabouts in Vietnam were you? I
was in up in the Central Highlands, town Pleiku with the Central Highlands with the 57th Assault Helicopter Company.
Okay.
And at that time, most of the infantry was gone. It was now becoming an air war and a tank war. So anyway, they taught me how to do it, and I went on a few missions, and I don't know, I probably flew 4 or 5 missions in the front seat, and, fired off the miniguns and stuff, and that was a pretty good deal. And then they said, well, you have your instrument rating too. And I said, yeah. I said, well, we want you to fly the Nighthawk ship. We want to expand the territory. He says, all the Nighthawk ship does is it goes around the perimeter of Camp Holloway in the Military 2 region and Artillery Hill. We think we could better use, you could go out and look for stuff. How do you feel about that? So I said, well, I feel good about it. So they put me with the Nighthawk pilot who was a W1. And because I went to Fort Lewis, I had actually graduated from flight school before he did. And then I had all of this time at Fort Lewis. And plus I received my instrument rating, and he didn't take too liking to me. And I said, well, you ever gonna let me fly this thing? I think we were like a week, and he never let me touch the controls. And he says, well, I'll tell you when you can. And I said, Chief, let me tell you something. I said, your job is to teach me. Right. Your job is to teach me this AO. Your job is to get me familiar with this aircraft because you're leaving. And I said, you're not doing a very good job of it. And I says, now I better start flying this, and I better be involved in some of the operational planning of this. I said, or you and I and Captain McDonald are going to have a serious talk. And he looked at me, and so I started flying, and we didn't say much to each other. Within 2 weeks, I was got my aircraft commander check right out of the way, and now I've got the Nighthawk ship, and quite an experience. It was an H model Huey.
It was a Huey though, right? Still a Huey?
Pardon me?
It was still a Huey? Yep.
Okay. It was the long body. And we had twin miniguns on it. Instead of M60s, we had a minigun on port, minigun on starboard. We had a Xeon infrared light. Crew of 6. Boy, for some reason, this thing's not liking me.
Yeah, it just times out. That's no big deal, Greg.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, all you gotta do is just move the mouse around a little bit.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Every like 5 minutes, just move the mouse a little bit. It'll
okay.
time out with that.
I told you you're going to have to hold my hand, Glenn. I'm not too technically savvy here, so yeah, we had the Crew 6, one gunner for each minigun, one operator for the Xeon light, and then we had on the other side of the aircraft, on the starboard side, we had a handheld M60, and then there was the pilot, the co-pilot on the right. And now I had graduated the left seat. I was an aircraft commander, and our mission had changed, not dramatically, but enough to make a difference. We were starting to fly further out at night, looking for bad guy activity. And the reason being is, like I said, the infantry guys were pretty much gone. And the bad guys, the NVA, were starting to rear their ugly head using tanks. So the idea was that I could maybe go out 30, 40 kilometers. I could get at an area I was familiar with, and keep it at a certain altitude. And then we'd put that Xeon light out there, and we'd look for dust trails. We'd look for anything we could to find activity. And we would find some stuff. We would report it in, and sure enough, they know what there are tank tracks out there. And they've, now this leads to another story. I mean, they all intertwine, but they were getting pretty bold at that time because they didn't have the infantry guys to run interference. So the rocketing increased. We were getting rocketed on a regular basis, every day, every night. And it just so happens that one of the cab units, the first cab, had stood down at Camp Holloway, and they had put all of their tents and all of their gear right between the two flight lines. Well, guess where the rockets hit?
Everything got blown up, right?
Just blew their stuff to holy hell. And Captain McDonald says, he called me Hutson. He says, come on with me. We got to go check something out. I said, okay, what is it, Captain Mac? He says, let's do a back azimuth, because there were, I mean, they unloaded that day with the rockets, and you could see where they were hitting. And we did a back azimuth, checked the map out. And I said, oh, I'm familiar with that area. He says, I want you to take a light fire team, a couple Cobras out, and go do some damage. He said, we need to stop this. Okay. So I get a hold of Nick, who was arguably the bravest man I'd ever met in my life. And I'll tell you that story in a little bit. And Wayne Simmons, both Cobra pilots, both salt of the earth kind of guys. They like to have the fun, but when you stepped on that flight line, it was all about business. I mean, I respected those guys. They had just the best attitude, and they were team players. So I talked to Nick and I said, Nick, here's what we'll do. I'll circle around. We'll go locate them. I said, as soon as you see that light come on, you just get into a run and just launch all your rockets at that time. And I told Wayne, I said, the same thing. I'll keep it on target as long as I can. And long story short, it was successful. Came back and a day or two later, Captain Max had the after action report. He says, remarkable what we were able to accomplish. And we didn't get rocketed for 30 days after that.
That was,
and Captain Max is great. He says, he said, Hutz, he says, you guys did a good job. He says, I want you to tell the crew how much I appreciate it. You threw everything at it but the kitchen sink. Okay. So I go back and I tell the guys, now I got to show you, I have a picture of the crew. And I hope you can see this.
oh yeah. Yep. Oh, that's awesome. Awesome.
They were Nighthawk at night, and during the daytime, they still had Cobras that they were responsible for. So they were crew chiefs on Cobras, and then they were crew members on the Nighthawk. And most of the crew chiefs wanted to fly, but I had two that Bob and Monty, they always went with me. And, oh, wait, let me shut the door here. So I was telling him, I said, Captain Max, he was very thankful for what we did the other night. And he said, and I gave him a wink and a nod. And I said, yeah, he said, we threw everything at it but the kitchen sink. So it was, I don't know, a few days later, 10 days, I don't remember. But Bobby comes up to me and he says, hey, LT, he says, got something out the aircraft I want to show you. And because of the night mission, because I was the only one on call at night, we parked in the revetment closest to the Cougar Hooch. And so I'm going out and I'm looking and I said, oh, okay, we got a rotor blade, got a tail rotor. Yeah, guns are there. Everything looks good. What do you got? And he says, over there. And I said, that's a toilet. He says, yeah, it is. And I said, well, what's that doing there? And he says, well, we couldn't find a kitchen sink. We went to the dump. We couldn't find one. But this is the closest thing we got. It was a stadium size, I'll say 3 or 4 man wide. It was cast iron, porcelain plated urinal. And I said, well, if you want to drop that out of the Nighthawk ship, I said, you're going to have to clean it up. We will do it. Boy, they got right on it. And then I thought, oh God, I don't want to do this. So I didn't know what was going to come of it. And they cleaned it up. And I said, okay, the next time we get a full moon without a cloud in the sky, we'll go drop it. Guess what? Next full moon, not a cloud in the sky. And I can't go back on my word. So anyway, we go out, we drop it over the lake. And it auto-rotated down. It had a lip on the toilet and it caught air and it just spun going down. So I put the collective down, went into auto rotation. We followed it down. It was a pretty sight, Clint. It was absolutely gorgeous. It had hit the water and it bounced back up and it eventually sank. And the guys just got a huge thrill out of that. And so we get back and a couple of days later, Captain Max he said, hey, were you flying the other night? And I said, oh, I'd have to check, Captain Max. He said, don't lie to me. He says, you're the only one that flies at night. Said, what do you got? And he said, we've got a report from the locals that you were trying to sink their boats. What? He says, yeah, well, there's some boats out there. And he says that whatever it was you dropped hit pretty close. Now tell me what's going on. I says, well, first thing, they shouldn't be out there after sunset. Right. He said, good point. He says, now tell me more. So I told him what happened. I said, you told us that we threw everything but the kitchen sink. And I said, the guys used some of their ingenuity and they went out and looked for a sink. They couldn't find one. Well, they got the next best thing. And he says, you've got to be kidding me. He said, he told me, he says, forget I ever said that to you. So anyway, that was it for the sake, but we did a lot of flying. There was a lot of tank activity going on. And I don't know if you're familiar with a operational system called the TOW missile.
Yep.
Okay, well, the TOW got its first chance in battle out of Pleiku, out of Camp Holloway. They run in a couple B model Hueys with tow systems on them. And after they work out the kinks, they went out and, a short period of time, I don't know, it was a week, they got 24 tanks.
Jeez,
24,
wow.
24 Russian tanks. They're just, and come to find out, the intelligence told us they didn't know where was this coming from. How's this working? But for those that aren't familiar with a TOW, you fire a wire guided missile, and it for up to 3 kilometers, this wire's attached. And one of the guys in the pilot seat has a scope, and he flies that missile to the target.
Yeah, I use those in the Marine Corps.
Oh, you did? Okay. So anyway, the first TOW was in 1972. And it was, I don't know, it was May or June. It was during the Easter offensive. And it was pretty horrendous because there was nothing. We didn't have ground troops. They started the bombing again with the B-52s. Thank goodness for that. That saved our bacon. But you could feel those arc light strikes. That ground would shake at night. You'd feel the rumbling. But the guys in the TOW went out and they really put a stop to things. And it was their first battle experience with the TOW. And from then on, that's the TOW that we have now is based on those TOWs that they fired then. Well, I was part of it. I got to see the ships. I didn't fly in them when I say I was part of it, but I did get to see them. I got to sit in the cockpits and talk to some of the guys. And one of the guys I talked to, I reconnected with him 2 years ago. Yeah, but we were flying Hueys in Indiana.
Uh-huh.
So then I was getting towards, I was over halfway done with my tour. And I went on R&R and I came back home. You weren't supposed to, but I came back to the States, and the wife and kids wanted to go to Disneyland, and we go to Disneyland. Thought this is pretty cool. Man, I am out of my element now. This is just great, just relaxing. So we went over to, Frontierland, where they had the water and they had the wheelboat, and then they had the pirate ship come along. So I'm bringing over a tray full of hamburgers and French fries and sodas. And they're all sitting at this table on this little dock that they have, this pier. And that Pirate of the Caribbean ship, point blank, fired off his air cannon. I was on the ground, I think faster than the food. I got down and I'm looking and people are laughing. Well, I'm not laughing because 4 days ago, I was in the middle of this stuff. Right. And they didn't know that. And this one kid came up, and I call him a kid. He was a young man. He had on his food service whites, and he had his hat on, and he said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "That just scared the crap out of me." And he said, "You just get back from Vietnam?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I was there 4 days ago." And he says, "Well, I came back from Vietnam. I've got this job." And he says, "I hate it when they fire that cannon off." And he says, "I understand." He says, "Why don't you go have a seat over there?" He says, "Just relax. What did you have? What was your order?" And I said, "Well, everybody had a burger, fries, blah, blah, blah." He went and he had the order refilled, cleaned the mess up, came over and shook my hand, never saw him again. But I mean, that was an experience. So anyway, I get back over to Vietnam, and they call me up and they say, "You're going to Fort Leonard Wood as a basic training company commander." I go, "Wait a minute, I'm an aviator. I'm not a company commander material, but I'm an infantry guy." This was before they had the aviation branch reestablished. So I said, "Well, what are my options?" It says, "I can tell you, I don't want to go to Fort Polk. Big mistake. I should have gone." And I said, "I know my wife doesn't want to go there." And I said, "If you want to save my marriage," I said, "can you put me on the West Coast anywhere?" And he says, "Well, what if we release you from your obligation, your 6-year obligation to the military after flight school? How about we just let you out?" And I said, "Okay, I'll do that." So I'm figuring right after the turn of the year, I'll get my orders. So October, I've got my orders for release, and I would be out
Still-
on November.
Were you still in Vietnam?
Still in Vietnam, and I would be out of the Army by November the 3rd. So I'm getting 2 months off my sentence.
Wow.
I call it a sentence, but my obligation and my tour. And right about that time, we had one of the nastiest encounters with the NVA just south of Camp Holloway. And this is, I was telling you about Nick. Gary Onifrey, who was a warrant officer, and Jim Duggar was the lieutenant. Jim was the new guy, Gary was the aircraft commander. They go flying into this fire base along with John Ross and William Smith and the crew chiefs and the gunners, along with this one specialist, communications guy. And they're there to pick up some people that were injured somehow, whatever. So the helicopter's sitting on the ground, it's running. And next thing you know, an RPG comes through the cockpit window and it immediately kills the right seater, Lieutenant Duggar. He's unfortunately, he lost his life. And the kid that was sitting right behind him, Specialist Craig, unfortunately lost his life. It was just, he was decapitated, and it was a mess. The front of the Huey was blown off, but it's still running. The controls are still there. The panel's gone. I mean, it's just, I don't know if you could have flown it or not. Gary said he thought about it. He was the left seater, but he was severely injured, and he was going in and out of consciousness, and he gave up that idea, he told us later. And John Ross went and got Gary out of there. Here comes the NVA. There are about 300 of them. They want to overtake this aircraft. Here comes Nick and his Cobra. Nick is just putting everything he's got on him, and so is his cover ship. And they're doing the best they can to keep bad guys off, giving John enough time to hide. Well, they got into some elephant grass. Nick distracted him enough, and Nick's run out of ammo. He calls up and he says, "Hey, this is Cougar 4-2." He says, "Going to send me some help down there?" And he says, "Well, we've got somebody on the way. They should be there in a few minutes." And he says, "You need to leave the area." And Nick said, "I'm not leaving." He says, "I'll fall out of the sky trying to protect these guys, but I'm not leaving." So Nick did the best thing, next best thing. His backup ship took off to go refuel, rearm. And there was another flight supposedly coming down, and they got there. But Nick just played dodgeball with the guys. Takes his Cobra going low level. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, the only time you get that low level is when you're taking off or landing.
Completely empty too, right?
He was, yeah. And it was maneuverable because he didn't have a lot of weight. But the guy that was front seater, Wayne Warish, who I'd flown with before on the Nighthawk, after that day, Wayne said, "I'm not flying anymore." He was done. But Nick didn't look at it like that. Nick said, "It's just part of the job. This is what I'm doing." And he says, I'm gonna protect these guys." So the guy that comes in to pick him up was on a check ride with a brand new pilot, first day. And he says, we're going down to Firebase St. George. He says, "You just hold on." He says, "Don't say anything, don't touch anything." So Rich is on a second tour. He goes in and he's in the worst Huey we've got in the outfit. He goes in, he lands and picks these guys up and gets them out of there. Meantime, Nick is now gone because the other Cobras are on. But between Rich Clover and Nick Harrington doing what they did, the odds, talk about being stacked against you. I mean, Nick didn't have anything going for him. He couldn't fire back. And he was a very imposing target from the side. But from the front, a Cobra's nothing. It's low profile. But from the side, great target. But Nick didn't care. He just kept it up. So shortly after that, I came back and I had that on my mind. And so I've got about a 3-week reprieve before I went back to the Bureau of Prisons. I had wrote him a letter, told him I'm coming back. And just before Thanksgiving, they brought me back on. So I came back to Lompoc afterwards, and I'm still thinking about those guys. I couldn't shake it. And so I came back and they said, well, the lieutenant said, "Well, you're not a new guy." I said, "No, I have some experience." And he says, "Well, I'm going to put you on activities." I said, "Why don't you follow the quarter officer around and kind of get used to things?" I said, okay. And I just noticed things had changed. You know, it wasn't the old staff that we had had. Those old
What's this, like almost 5 years later, right? 4 or
yeah,
5?
it's three, almost four.
Yep.
And there had been quite a turnaround in staff. There were a lot of new guys, a lot of Vietnam veterans who had come in right about the time I left. And they had gone through the ranks. Now they're GS 6, 7s. They're making their 8s. So the eight ranks are just pretty much filled up by now. But the inmates changed too. We're getting, you know, it wasn't I'll call them draft dodgers. They were pretty easy to get along with. They didn't want any trouble. The car thieves, yeah, a few of them would get in trouble, but now we were getting drug dealers and bank robbers.
Yeah, the real bad guys are coming.
Pardon me?
Oh, the real bad guys are starting to come.
Yeah, the real bad guys are coming, and so I noticed that, and I noticed there were a lot more incidents. I noticed a lot more triple deuces. And, you know, it wasn't because of the staff. Believe me, the staff that we had were, you know, we still had a few of the old timers. Don't get me wrong, but we had a lot of the new guys with that military training. I mean, they caught on quick,
Yeah.
and they were good officers. The Eddie Gouges of the world, Ken Ox, Ed Yorks, just Larry Haney's of the world. I mean, they were there. They were good, solid people. And the one thing I noticed after I'd been back for a while, that now that all of these GS8s have been taken up, you know, there's no room for advancement. I came back as a GS7, thank goodness. I left as a GS4, and well, they just promoted me to a 5, and I came back as a 7-step 2 or 3. I can't remember, but it was going to be some time before I could make 8. And I realized that. And it wasn't too much longer after that. One of the first lieutenants I ever had, a gentleman named Cyril Myhand, who was an Alcatraz veteran. And in fact, that's where he started, was Alcatraz. Cyril was a lieutenant at Lompoc, and he liked me because as a young guy, I'd do anything, everything. And a lot of those old timers really kept a close eye on me because I was the same age as their kids, and I knew a lot of their kids, went to school with them. So I go, what's this idiot doing here? So, but anyway, well, there we go. I got to do that moving the mouse thing again. Huh.
I still see you. You're still there.
Okay. Well, it's not cooperating. There we go. Okay, I'll start moving the mouse. So I get in touch with Cyril Mayan, and he says, Craig, he says, I don't know if you're up for this or not, but if you're willing to lateral transfer, he says, within a year, you can get your aid. He said, I do not have enough qualified people. He says, all I've got right now are a lot of VRAs. He says, a lot of GS6s. He said, most of our senior 7s are being promoted. He says, we'll probably have another board in a couple months, and we should have another board right after the first of the year. So I said, well, I talked to my wife and said, okay. So I did a lateral down to Terminal Island as a GS7, and totally different world than Lompoc. Lompoc, you were involved in shakedowns and searches. You were involved in confrontations with inmates. At TI, it was the click of the bocce balls and watching the old guys smoking their cigars and just going to their quiet units and stuff like that. Well, they started getting a few more criminals, so to speak, and they had their first killing at TI. And I just happened to be there for it. And they said, well, here's what we need to do. And they said, well, why do you know this? I said, well, it just happened at Lompoc. I said, that's pretty much what we do there. And so, okay. So anyway, so I spent the time there, and it was a pretty good experience. And shortly after that, they opened up a new institution in Dublin. And this new institution was going to have unit management. We're also going to get our first regional director. This is all new stuff. This is all coming out of the blue. And so the captain at Dublin was a lieutenant at Terminal Island, John Brown. And before John left, he says, Greg, he says, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider coming up to Dublin as a GS8. He said, if you want it, we'll make it happen. And that's probably one of the few times where somebody says, yeah, we'll make it happen, and it happened. And so I put my name in the hat, and there was an 8 board coming up at Terminal Island. And Lieutenant now Captain Myhan says, you got your choice. He says, you're either going to get it here or get it there. And he says, I recommend you go up there, get that experience of opening up a new institution under your belt. It'll help you in the long run. Okay. So I took the job, went up to Dublin in May of 74. It was a federal youth center. We opened it up. We had 8 GS8s. Well, we had a warden, 2 AWs, had the captain. And then we had this new program called unit management. And they had 2 buildings, and they divided each building in half and call it a unit. So we had four unit managers. Each unit manager, I can't remember how many people were on the side. I think there were like 90 on each side. 3 counselors, 30-person caseload. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
That was something.
Yeah.
And they had a unit secretary for each side. So here we are. We have all of these people working, the unit management people, and then you had your custody guys. We had 311 lieutenants. So one of the GS8s was going to be acting lieutenant at certain times. So we all got a 2-week shot at that. The thing about Dublin that was unique was they were trying to make it user friendly. That's what I say. They had a lake in the middle of the compound. It's now closed in a long time ago, but they had put water in it. Well, they naturally with the lake, and they had paddle boats. And the inmates could get on these paddle boats. Well, being co-ed, they would let a male and a female ride in the paddle boat together. And this is a circus. All these young kids, their hormones are just like off the chart.
How old were they?
Pardon me?
How old were the inmates?
Oh, most of them were early 20s.
Okay.
Maybe late 20s, a few of the teenagers that arrived by then, but nobody at that time, nobody under 18. And we weren't open too awful long, and then they changed the mission. They said, you know what, we're going to make this an FCI. So we never got the young kids. So they made it an FCI, and it was something. Having to, they could hold hands.
Jesus.
They let them do things like that. And Glenn, I tell you what, that was not for me.
Oh.
I didn't fit in well there. I did the post orders. I did things like that. Got to be lieutenant. I'd lock people up, and they would let them out the next day saying, you can't lock them up. The unit staff would, because all that guy did was cuss you out. I said, well, that's all it takes. I said, you cuss me out and see what happens. So I got out there as soon as I could. I would have been better, I think, if I would have just gone along with the program and stayed there, but I didn't. And Lompoc was going to unit management, and they needed GS9 counselors. So somebody from Lompoc called me up and says, yeah, put your name in the hat. They'd love to have you. I said, okay. So I put my name in the hat, and I went down as a counselor, and they put me in a unit, and each unit had the same thing: unit manager, case manager. We had 3 counselors for every 120 inmates. So I had 40 on my caseload, and my unit manager is a guy named O.C. Jenkins. And I don't know if you know that name or not, but he was part of the new guard, and he came in, and he says, he talked to the counselors. He says, talk to this guy. He says, you're going to be this, have these guys, you're going to have these guys, and Greg, you're going to have these guys. Okay. He says, Greg, also, he says, you're going to have the unit 5 days a week. Okay, what does that mean? He said, well, he said, what they did was they made a deal with correctional services. If they gave each unit a 3rd counselor, the unit management staff agreed that they would run the unit during the day watch. So that way they could have an extra counselor do some of the work. And I said, okay. I says, well, what about, what are your expectations? And he says, well, just like the rest of them, you have a team, you have to get ready for team and one thing or another. And I'm going, well, I still have to run the unit. He says, no, what you'll do in the morning, he says, after work call, you lock the door. Just before lunch, you'll open it. I said, boss, I said, you got a lot of off-duty inmates. We've got people going on appointments. We've got shakedowns we need to do, unit inspections. And he says, no, we're not going to do that anymore.
Oh.
And okay, you may not. I didn't say anything. I said, but I am. So I took the unit and I went around and he asked me, he says, why aren't you down in the office? I said, well, after work call, you got to go around and check, see who's in the unit. And first of all, it's security. Is anybody hurt? Anything happen? I said, it's just something that you do. I said, we're still in a prison. He says, no, we're going to quit doing that. And I says, Mr. Jenkins, I said, sir, all due respect, I don't think you understand. And he says, no, you don't understand. And I said, okay, that's fine. Tell me what you want me to do. So I did what he wanted me to do. The unit sanitation fell off tremendously.
I bet.
Contraband was showing up in abundance. People that didn't belong in the unit were showing up. During work call, you pop that door open, you don't know who's coming or going because you may get distracted at the front door. You shouldn't, but you do. People sneak in and things were happening. And I told him, and he says, well, that's okay. We'll let the lieutenant's office worry about that. And I said, what do you think? They're going to come down here and run the office? I said, didn't you make an agreement that we would take care of the unit? And I said, Mr. Jenkins, all due respect, there's only one way to run a unit. And he said, well, I don't like your attitude. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I says, well, we have an obligation, to make sure that the place is secure, that there is accountability. I said, that's what we're here for. Well, he and I never did see eye to eye on that. And it was, I don't know, after about a year and a half of unit management going through all of this, and they had a guy named Doug Lansing come out. He was from program division back at the central office. And Mr. Lansing was interviewing all the unit staff from all the units. And what do they think? And I came in to interview him and he goes, oh, Mr. Hutson, he said, I've heard about you. And I said, oh, I hope good things. And he says, well, quite the contrary. And he said, I understand you have a little problem with the program. And I says, well, tell me more, and he did. And I says, well, I says, we have a distinct difference in how things should be done. And he says, would you mind telling me? And I says, well, whether you like it or not, unit management or not, all these new programs you want to implement, we're still in a prison. And, we've got a sophisticated crowd now. We've got bank robbers, we got drug dealers, you name it. We've got, what do you call those guys? Cowboys, people bringing people across the border. Things were happening. And often we started to see the advent of prison gangs, which we hadn't had before. And he didn't want to hear it either. And I said, accountability and security. And I said, we don't have an inner unit. And I said, I do the best I can to maintain it. He says, well, that's not your job anymore. That's the custody's job. And I reminded him about that counselor thing. Anyway, that didn't go over too well. And then before you know it, pretty soon I was getting asked to be acting lieutenant. And I jumped at that. Next thing you know, I made lieutenant and I'm out of the unit. And I go, thank goodness. But the other thing about unit management at the time, they were dictating that counselors would take inmates into town and take them to lunch. Wow. And I did once and one time only.
One inmate, you bring them out in town?
Two. You take two inmates who had custody. We got a guy that was doing 15 years bank robbery, hadn't even been in a year. They gave him minimum custody. And they told me that I would take him and this drug dealer out down to McDonald's, take him to lunch, and then drive him around town. I said, well, how do you expect me to get there? I said, a government car. And they said, no, we expect you to take your own vehicle. Okay, so one time and one time only I did it. And then after that, I refused to take anybody out of my own vehicle. I said, if you want government business, we'll take him out in a government car. So okay, Hutson, you're off the list. You're not taking anybody out. And that was another reason why I wanted to get out of unit management at the time. They were trying to take an institution, a medium security that's now approaching even a higher level of security and turning it into a boys' school, so to speak. Well, that wasn't working, and the gangs were coming on, and we were getting McNeil Island's worse because McNeil Island was closing down. So we started getting a lot of the guys that were gang members at McNeil had just been paroled to the federal system from their state sentences. And these were bona fide hardcore Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, a few in Western Familiar, a few BGF, and a new group at the time called them Texas Syndicate. So as a lieutenant, I was kind of concerned about this, and I didn't even know how to spell Aryan. And Glenn, I hate to tell you this, I didn't even know what Aryan meant. So I started doing my homework, and the captain at the time, Jack Cully, knew I was really into this, and he said, I want you to get a hold of this guy up at McNeil Island. He used to be here before, Bob Kelly. So I called Bob up, and Bob was telling me, he says, Greg, he says, here's what's going on. And he says, I'll send you the paperwork, study this. And he says, I'm going to give you the names of some guys. Excuse me, Cully was AW at that time. He wasn't captain. So I get a hold of him, and he sends me the information down. He sends me pictures, everything, and how they were verified as being Mexican Mafia, their associations with the Mafia when they got in it, their state history. And he gave me the phone number of some people in the state, California state, who were on top of the prison gangs. So I've got this, and I started doing it, and I was the only one. And some of the other lieutenants go, do whatever you got to do with that gang stuff. It's nothing.
Yeah, it's no big deal.
It's not, it doesn't amount to nothing. It wasn't, I don't know, about a month or so, and I'd been working on this, and I realized who we had and what we had, and nobody wanted to listen. So I talked to the warden. I said, Warden Taylor, I said, I'm going above everybody else's head to see you, but you know what, you're running this institution. I think you need to know some things. Well, come on in the office, Greg. Great guy, Larry Taylor. So I explained to him.
Greg, were you considered like the SIS lieutenant then, or what were you?
I was a GS9, but they made me an assistant to the SIS.
Okay.
I wasn't the SIS because the SIS didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Oh,
he says, if you want to handle it, go ahead. That's a good question. Thanks for clarifying that. So I went to Warden Taylor. Warden Taylor, I said, here's what we got. I said, I want you to see this stuff. And I showed it to him, and he goes, okay. And his eyes got big. And I said, now all these pictures, all these names of people and the pictures that I've showed you. And I said, here's a list. They're at Lompoc right now. He says, you think we ought to be paying attention to them? And I says, I think we ought to be paying attention to them seriously, big time. I explained to him about with Kelly, and there was somebody else I was talking to at Leavenworth. So we were getting mostly a few Aryan Brother hotshots. Prior to that, we had Barry Mills and Tommy Silverstein. I don't know if those names ring a bell.
Yeah, oh yeah.
They were walking our corridor, and then we had guys in the Mafia, Champernoso, Snuffy Sanchez, Bobby Black, yada yada, all the big dogs, all the heavy hitters, and we got them all at one time. Oh. And so I'm trying to catalog these guys as best I can, come up with information. And shortly thereafter, there was a homicide in one of our cell houses, C unit. And apparently the guy had been sitting on the toilet. Two Mexican Mafia guys, we found out later, went in and stabbed him while he was sitting on the can. And they over 100 stab wounds. And typical Mexican Mafia hit, they just make a bloody mess, and they're making a point. Well, they got him off the toilet and they just shoved him under the bed. What was funny about that was on the third tier. It was on E range down in F unit. And we were interviewing some of the inmates, and one of the inmates lived in the exact cell number on F range. He was on the third tier, had the same last name is the guy that was killed. And he says, I think I'm next. I says, well, why do you say that? He says, they hit the wrong guy. That should have been me. He said, I owe those guys some money. Okay, locked the institution down, ran him down to SEG and, protective custody. And so that was our first encounter with the Mexican mafia. I don't think anybody, with a few exceptions, some of the, the Vietnam veterans, that have ever seen that big of a mess
Oh, I
of
bet.
one human body. And it sure opened the doors for a lot of people. And
Woke some people up, definitely, with that.
oh, it sure did. And it wasn't long after that, there was another hit down in M Unit. A guy named Trejo was at Terminal Island, and he'd been transferred to Lompoc. Well, why he got transferred was he was involved in a hit down at TI, but he muffed it. He didn't kill the guy he was supposed to kill. Later on, we learned that was his initiation into the mafia. And Trejo was in M Unit. He was living on the flats. One of the officers was making his rounds one time and looked, and there was Trejo underneath the bed, bloody mess. They pulled him out, and his chest cavity was gone. He looked like a watermelon.
Jesus.
You ever get the top of a watermelon off? And what do you see? It's all red, and it's wet, and it's a mess. And that's what he looked like. He was done. I mean, he's toast. There's no saving that boy. So this is the second Mexican mafia hit. Now the ABs were in their ugly head. They're starting to do things. They're hitting people in the corridor. They're hitting people in the units. People are coming running out of the units, running down to the lieutenant's office. It's the boss locked the door. They're after me. And sure enough, they were. And then we'd eventually get the guy in protective custody. And this was my initiation to Muslims. We had the East Coast blacks who were predominantly Muslim, didn't know anything about them and what they were about. And then we had the West Coast blacks. They were, they weren't making life miserable for anybody. They're California guys.
Right.
They live in life easy. They don't. Yeah, well, the East Coast blacks didn't like that, the Muslim guys, and they were going to put the West Coast blacks on the straight and narrow. Well, then that started, and Jim Cooksey and Jim was the 11th lieutenant on the evening watch. This guy came running to the dining room, and he says, "You need to lock me up. They're after me." And next thing we know, here comes this guy, and I stopped the guy, and I says, "What do you need?" He said, "I just wanted to talk to my friend." "Yeah, I bet you do." Jim says, "I'm going to take him down to SEG." So I had the corridor officer. I said, "You take this guy." I said, "Get him in the lieutenant's office right now." So I went with Jim, and we're taking this guy down to lower I unit on the east side of the corridor. We get jumped.
Really?
We had some Muslim guys jump us right there at the entrance to I unit, and the kids' eyes. I mean, they were coming at us with shanks and everything. So Jim took us. Jim Hall asked, "Get this guy." Jim couldn't get into I unit fast enough, and he noticed the H unit door was open. So he's running this guy down to H unit, tried to get him in. I'm trying to keep these guys away. And 4-1, I'm not having luck. And plus they all had weapons. And the only thing I remember about that, I do not remember one of the faces of any of those four guys, but I do remember the guy that came at me had on black high top Converse tennis shoes, because I was watching the knife and I was watching his hand. And I didn't care what he looked like. And so I watched him, and he made a few swipes at us. And anyway, Jim gets him in. The inmate runs up to the third tier. The other inmates, the Muslims, are chasing him up the third tier. And the guy he goes airborne on us. No parachute. He jumps off the third tier.
Wow.
Roger Plummer, who was the unit officer, had no idea what was going on. "Roger, get this guy, lock him in the office." Roger locks him in the office, and then, we're calling for the cavalry. The deuces, somebody was able to hit the deuces. They called on the radio. Everybody from the camp came in. Officers from the West End locked their units down. They came to help us. I mean, it was Jim Cooksey got stabbed. Gene Gillespie, if it wasn't for his wallet and his radio, he would have been hurt. And if it wasn't for an inmate, and to this day, I swear it was an inmate, I'm not going to mention his name, but I heard him say, "Hutson, watch out." And next thing I know, I'm looking over my shoulder and here comes this knife.
Wow.
And it gets me on the neck. And the back of my shirt, I didn't realize it. Somebody tried to cut me up on the back of my shirt. Had no idea. And things were just happening fast. And fortunately, guys from the camp got in. It was funny because Cooksey was holding an inmate who was trying to get to the inmate in the office. Gene Gillespie was holding the inmate that was holding Cooksey, and I was holding the inmate that was on Gene Gillespie. And you talk about something odd happening. I've never seen that happen before, and I haven't seen it happen prior. This daisy chain's going on. And fortunately, enough staff came in from the reservation, and we got it taken care of. We got him locked down. And there's one guy left, and he made his way up to E Unit, and I want a piece of his ass. I'll tell you what, I was never so, how do you want to put it? I was pissed. So I'm going up, I'm going to get him. And I remember this guy, and he had a knife, and he goes down, and he goes like the fourth cell. And I said, you better bring that out. I said, because I'm coming down. I said, one of us is going to walk out, the other isn't. Hell, who knows? I just was, talking crap. And so anyway, this big black guy comes out and he says, hey boss, he says, hold on a second. I said, okay, you got 5 seconds. I don't know what I'm holding on for. And next time I see him, he's holding up his hand like this down by his pant pocket. He says, I got the knife. And he slips it back in his pocket. And he knew not to touch it. He touched it by the edges. So this other guy came out in front of him. He's scared to death. Now I've got the cavalry. They're up there with me. There's enough of us there to do some serious damage to this guy. Well, he gave up. So we finally get him away. So I get the knife from that one inmate. The guy had been a basketball player for the San Diego Clippers, professional basketball team in the NBA. I cannot remember his name, but he got involved with drugs and ended his career, and he ended up doing some time. So I'll finish the story. Well, make long story short, the first and only time I ever went to the parole board for somebody was this guy. And they gave him, back then the parole board, you didn't have the mandatory 85%, they'd go to the board for a hearing. And when I talked to Harry, who had used to work with us, the BOP, he was now with the parole commission or the parole board. And I says, Harry, I said, here's what this guy did. And Harry says, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I give him a favorable nod. He has been a model inmate since he's been here. He got his release. And they sent him back to San Diego, sent him to his home, a halfway house. They let him have a motorcycle. And I don't know where it was he was going, but I heard this later that he wasn't out a week, and it started raining in San Diego, and he was on his motorcycle, and he lost traction, and he fell, and a car ran over and killed him. Wow. I know, that was, I felt bad for that guy because he did a good thing for us. We reciprocated by going to the parole board for him. It didn't cost me anything but my time. So, and then, so anyway, that's that story. But, we were dealing with the gangs, and it got pretty bad. Mm-hmm. And the ABs were just, between the AB and the mafia, we were just, it was all the time.
And all those groups came from California's state system, right?
Yes, they did. You didn't see a lot of them in the Western Familia because they were mainly north. And so they didn't have a lot of them. And if they were at Lompoc, a couple of them got hit. They didn't advertise it. And then the Texas Syndicate was just, they were bad news. Texas Syndicate killed somebody, one in the heart and then 5 in the back. One in each lung, one in each kidney, and one where the heart would be in the back. So they all had their thing. AB, if they had to muscle a guy up, they did it. But Mexican Mafia, you knew you were going to get a bloody hit. You knew what you're going to get with Texas Syndicate, and AB's kind of in between. And we had this incident in the work order. The ABs were taking these homemade axes, and they were hitting some of their enemies in the head. And Jesus. So we got one guy in lower I unit. I won't mention his name because he went to the program. And I'll call him Billy. So I'm talking to him. I said, Billy, I said, let me ask you something. He goes, yeah, and he's standing up there, big guy. I mean, he's bulked up like a lot of them, tattooed from his neck on down to his feet. And I said, you got a wife and a family out there, don't you? He looks at me, he says, how do you know that? And I said, I know. I said, what are you doing locked up down here in this funky unit behind these bars, paying homage to these idiots who are going to end up having you do life sentences?
Right.
He said, do you love your daughters? He goes, of course I do. I said, you love your wife? I said, of course I do. And I said, well, shame on her for sticking around with you. I said, well, you think about it. And I said, if you think you want to rectify this problem, I said, you let me know. You just have somebody come get me. Well, it was now about 3 days later. He said, I thought about it. You're right. He said, I got a family out there. I'm not taking care of them. And he says, I thought about it. These guys aren't my family. I said, oh, okay. So I got a hold of the FBI and called Tom Mansfield. Tom talked to him, and I don't know, it was about a week, 10 days later, this guy in the middle of the night removed from the institution, never saw him again.
Yeah. Gave it up.
Maybe he had a change of heart, who knows?
Yeah.
So I'm fast forward, I'm at Otisville, I'm doing WITSEC. I get a call, you got to go pick up somebody in the state of Maine. Okay, so I go pick him up, and guess who it was? Billy. They were bringing him down to our WITSEC unit in Otisville. And then, I don't know, I was back at TI, I get a phone call. They said, hey, LT, you got a phone call. So I go to an outside line, I go, hello. And he goes, Greg? And the voice sounded familiar. And I said, yeah. He said, this is Billy. He says, what's up, man? He says, I just want to thank you for getting me straightened out. I never thought it'd work for a minute. I had no idea this guy would take it to heart, but he did. I don't know what's happened to him since. He says, but I'm in the program. I got a job. My girls are going to school. And he says, all I can tell you is I'm up to my ass in snow. I said, okay. But anyway, but we had a lot of the ABs, and they were just, a lot of them were making their quote unquote bones. They wanted to get mugged up with the guys. And so I had enough of that stuff. And I'd been doing that now for 3 years. And I tell you what, Glenn, I was worn out, and I put in for my 11 at Otisville and got it. So I went back there with future director Mike Quinlan as warden. Ed Brennan was our captain, one of the finest guys I ever met. And we had some great lieutenants. We just had some really good people. We got had a good start on the institution, except we had the Iranian dissidents come to us from, they had the hostages, 444 days, I think. Well, there was some problems going on in Iran with the Shah and then the Ayatollah. So you had the pro-Ayatollah faction, you had the pro-Shah faction, and they were creating disturbances in Washington, D.C. Well, it was the pro-Ayatollah guys. They brought them to Otisville, and we had them for about 3 days. And they got things cleared up with the State Department. They took about buses, came out, picked them up, let them go. They were pretty respectful. They didn't give us much of a problem. Then we got the pro-Shah guys. It was like day and night. What a bunch of idiots. They thought because they were pro-Shah, they were pro-USA, and they could do what they wanted. Now they're in this brand new housing unit, carving symbols into the walls and the dividers and the restroom dividers, and they had taken blankets and cut them up and using them for prayer blankets, and they would meet at a certain time. It was after the 4 o'clock count during their evening prayer or whatever, and they would meet at, if you haven't been to Otisville, they have the center of the unit. It was kind of unique, and that they all staged out there and they got on their prayer blankets, and I waited for them, and I didn't tell anybody I was going to do this, and I went right in the middle of them and I said, time out, fellas. Somebody looked at me and says, what are you doing? We're doing our prayer. And I says, no, I said, I'm running this institution. And I didn't tell Mike Quinlan I was doing it. I didn't tell Ed Brennan I was doing it. And I said, I want all of you to stand up. And they all stood up. And I says, now I want you to all to pick up those pieces of blanket. And I said, I want you to bring them over here, put them down. They did. And I said, no more of this. The guy from the State Department, a little redheaded guy that I didn't get along with too well because he's trying to treat these guys with kid gloves and the imam or whatever it was, he wasn't too happy. He says, well, they need to pray. They need to pray. They need to have their blanket. Blah, blah, blah. I said, this is not a prayer rug. This is a blanket. And I said, they're not going to do this anymore. Do you understand? And the guy, the State Department, was livid, and so was Ema. I said, hold on to that thought. So Ed was down there by now. I said, I'm going to go get Mike. And we called Warden Quinlan Mike, not to his face, but got to go get Mike. And he says, that's a good idea. And up there at the time was the regional director, Steve Gregoric. And I told him what's going on. I said, you need to come down, boss. And he said, okay. And Warden Quinlan came down, talked to the guy, and he said to him, he says, my lieutenant is running this. If he said that you cannot tear up blankets, he said, you cannot tear up blankets. And he left along with Gregoric. Right. That was the end of that. So anyway, so much for those guys. But I got to become a WITSEC lieutenant while I was there. One of the first in the Bureau. We had 2 for our region, the guy out of Petersburg and myself. And they said, he's the primary, he'll be doing most of the runs. And I said, okay, that's fine. I don't know, about 3 weeks later, the phone's jumping off the hook. I was gone more than I was there. I was taking people from you name it, I'd go pick them up, who knows where, Latuna, take them up somewhere north. And I get a call to go to Leavenworth, go to Kansas City. There's a guy coming from Leavenworth. I said, okay. And they all had these funny names like Lee Smith and Bob Boyd, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to pick up Lee Smith. And I said, okay. So I get there and I meet the marshals, and there's a BOP employee there with them. And they take me to the security area of the Kansas City airport. And I go through and I'm looking at this guy. And I said, no way in hell am I taking him. They look at me and said, what do you mean you're not taking him? Excuse me just a second. I said, he was involved in an escape attempt at Lompoc where a gun was involved, and he had the gun. What makes you think I want to take him somewhere? I said, my buddy Pete Graves and Lieutenant Fred Munns were there. They could have easily been killed, and this guy would have pulled the trigger. So I said, I'm not taking him. You better come up with something pretty darn good, or I'm leaving him here. Well, the marshal said, well, you have a job to do, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I know I have a job to do, but I know these inmates and I know this guy. So he said, boss, he said, I've changed. I said, yeah, I've heard that before. So I call up DC, and I'm talking to Walt Copeland. And I don't know if you know Walt or not, but Walt was running the program. I said, Walt, I got this guy. He said, yeah, we know about that. And he said, I'm sorry you didn't get the word beforehand. I said, okay, so what's the deal? He said, do me a favor, take him. He said, the FBI has vetted this guy. We've had SIS involved in it, and we don't think he's going to be a problem. I said, well, I'm going to do this for you. And I said, you owe me big time. So anyway, I took him to wherever it was I took him back to Otisville. So he came back to Otisville, and he was the engraver for the staff nameplates. That was his job. But I guess he had turned over. I didn't have anything to do with that one. If I ever saw that guy again, without knowing what he had done to change, I'll tell you what, Katie barred the doors, because I wasn't going to give him the benefit of any doubt. So spent my time at Otisville. We had the Iranians got to be the SIS. I was missing the kids. I was there 2 years. I had been divorced. My kids were back in California. And I talked to Warden Quinlan. I says, any chance I can get back to California? And he says, he didn't even bat an eyelash. He says, yeah. He said, do you know anybody back there? And I said, well, I think Warden Cohen. He says, I'll call him up. Later that day, Warden Quinlan calls me and he says, okay, you're going to TI with Warden Cohen. He says, the only thing we can do is, he said, because it's a lateral, we can't pay your way because it's not on merit promotion. He said, but what we'll do is we'll give you 2 weeks admin time and we'll give you some per diem.